Welcome, welcome. We are thrilled to have you here for a wonderful evening. And I want to thank the hundreds that are joining us online this evening. We are so thrilled to have you with us virtually on what is a gorgeous day here in Hyde Park. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Seth Green, and on an evening like this one, I have the utter joy of saying that I'm the Dean of the Graham School, and we are the home of ambitious lifelong learning at the University of Chicago. For those who are not familiar with us, you should be. We are a place where learning comes to have fun at the University of Chicago across all ages and stages of life. Our signature programs are in the great books, in the Master of Liberal Arts, where you can go across the domains of the university in graduate study, and in Leadership and Society, where you look at how to have an ambitious next chapter after great accomplishment, where that success really turns into significance. And beyond those three signature programs, we have a course catalog that every quarter of the academic year has typically 70 to 80 courses on everything that the university explores, so that you have at your fingertips a way to deeply and hopefully more meaningfully understand the world. And tonight's gathering is going to follow on that focus of understanding the world, because we have one of the world's truly great authors, Amitav Ghosh, and we are so excited to have you here with us, and we are so looking forward to the conversation. And it's so important, I think, that we understand why his work is so significant in this moment. We are living through what you have described as a catastrophic convergence, where we have historical and sociological and many factors kind of coming together, and the pace and level of disruption in good and challenging ways is greater than ever. And it's hard in many ways for human minds, not necessarily accustomed to change, to comprehend and imagine all of the possibilities that are before us, because the climate, if you look at AI, if you look at a number of these factors, they are often beyond immediate human comprehension. And what literature allows us to do is it allows us to expand our imagination and our capacity to think openly and deeply about possibilities. And I think especially in a time where we are facing what could be both incredibly exciting but also existential threats, and that's where the elders' work comes in so perfectly to our community, we really need to have literature as a way to deepen our understanding and to expand the possibilities. And Amitav's work does exactly that. Amitav was born in Calcutta and grew up across India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He studied in Delhi, Oxford, and Alexandria, a biography that in itself talks about the interconnectedness of our world. Over nearly 4 decades, he has written novels that have won every possible award, and that includes India's Jnanath Prize, which is the highest literary honor in that country. And it was the first time that it was ever given to an English language writer. So that's just a sign of how significant his writing has been across the globe. He's held 5 Lifetime Achievement Awards. He has 6 honorary doctorates. Foreign Policy named him one of the most important global thinkers of the past decade, which is quite remarkable because they're usually not thinking about literature. And your work is so significant that it changes the way we look at international relations. In 2024, he received the Erasmus Prize and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His book, The Great Derangement, which I know our seminar looked at today, asked why climate change had proven so resistant to the imagination, why our stories had failed us at the very moment we needed them most. His newest collection, published by University of Chicago Press, so he has great taste in presses. Wild Fictions continues that inquiry, tracing the threads from imperialism and colonialism through the climate crisis and into the search for narratives and ways of living that might offer a genuine path forward. Tonight's conversation with Amitav will be moderated by our own Lin Atnip, who is a wonderful instructor in our basic program here at the Graham School. She completed her PhD in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, where she focused on how literature educates us to the conditions of modernity. Her first book, which was recently published, takes up the question of how we read our way through endings. And I heard just before I got up here that she's just received a very exciting award for her original story of fiction, and so is now an award winner in that category as well. And with that, I will welcome them both to the stage and look forward to the conversation ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's very exciting. And thank you, Amitav. I first encountered Amitav's work back at the University of California, Santa Barbara's Center for Humanities and Social Change, where we were thinking about how the humanities can help us grapple with, or at least understand, the problem of climate change. And we read The Great Derangement. Is the sound good? Okay, it's a little echoey. And then in the courses that Charles and Amy Thomas and Elder are teaching now in the basic program, the Ends of Humanity sequence, ENDS in parentheses, both are purpose and possible other kinds of ends. We again read The Great Derangement and found it very stimulating, provoking us to try and pull off the coup of having Amitav join us this evening. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Is this on? Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Charles and Amy, for contacting me and inviting me. Thank you, Seth, for your very generous introduction. It's really nice to be here on such a pleasant occasion. And it's nice to know that the University of Chicago, where I was always told, where fun went to die, actually has a fun program.
That's why we're here, to have fun at the end of the world. So primarily, we're going to focus on your most recent book of nonfiction, Wild Fictions, but I probably won't be able to help myself from spilling into earlier work and more general topics a bit. So the essays that are collected in Wild Fictions cover a long period of time, I think around 25 years, and so somewhat span at least a good portion of your career. Can you say something about how your views have changed over that time, and maybe specifically from the time of The Great Derangement, the book, The Great Derangement, if they have?
Well, I wouldn't say that my views have changed as such, but they've certainly evolved. And yeah, I mean, these essays go back over 25 years. And, I've learned a lot over those 25 years. So I think the earliest essay in this book was written in 1999, just before I started researching my novel, The Hungry Tide, which is set in the Sundarbans. And really, it was researching that book, The Hungry Tide, that alerted me to what's going on, in terms of the broader environment. And of course, it's not just climate change. As Margaret Atwood once famously said, it's everything change. That's really the world we live in. And in fact, even more important than climate change, perhaps, is biodiversity loss, species extinctions. I mean, we are facing really a polycrisis of multiple dimensions, yeah, I mean, my thinking on all of that sort of constantly updates itself because, I like to read, I like to learn from people like you.
Thank you. The polycrisis is a word that's come to mind that maybe is more comprehensive, at least. Since you mentioned the Hungry Tide, which some of the people in this room just gathered over the weekend to have a discussion about, you of course write both fiction and nonfiction. And can you say a little bit about how you conceive the relation between those two things? Do you see them as addressing the same problems and converging on the same topic? And are there things you feel like you can do in each that are complementary or maybe even in tension in sometimes?
Well, I began my career as a cub reporter for the Indian Express in New Delhi. This was way, way back. I mean, I was actually in college then, and I started working for the paper. But it was a very formative experience because I started way back when Indira Gandhi imposed this dictatorship called the emergency. And the Indian Express was then just about the only paper in India that was actively anti-government, So we were constantly raided and, generally harassed and things. And it was an incredibly important learning time for me. And in some ways that how shall I say, that reflex of making notes has always stayed with me, Even whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction, I just find it very, very important to constantly be taking notes about things. And I think that's what's really kept me sort of engaged with writing nonfiction. My experience of journalism. So, yes, I mean, for me, fiction and nonfiction, they're very different in many ways, because when I'm writing nonfiction, I never allow myself to make up anything. I mean, I believe very much in sticking to the facts, Mm-hmm. But, even if you have all the stuff out there, you can give it any shape you want. And that's where my experience as a writer of fiction is really useful. So the analogy that I think of, to describe the distinction between fiction and nonfiction, for me at least, is that of pottery, Because if you're working with a potter's wheel, the clay is there. It's outside yourself. You can't change the material, but you can give it any shape you want. Whereas when you're writing fiction, you're both shaping it and you're producing the material out of your head. So it comes already sort of half-shaped. So I would say that, for me at least, fiction is a different order of challenge and a different order of satisfaction. I mean, I just get so much pleasure, really, from writing fiction. But when I'm not writing fiction, I kind of resent it. But, sometimes one feels one has to do it, so.
Thank you. I think I'll return to questions of fiction in a bit, but since they're on the other side of some things that I want to touch on first. Turning to the book, so you start out by writing that the main thread running through the essays is the rupture in time that occurred in the late 20th century, revealing that the teleology that had sustained modernity with its promises of never-ending growth and promise was a delusion. Can you just expand a little on how you see this rupture?
Well, I think we're all beginning to see it now, aren't we? I mean, certainly I was thinking about that way back in 1999. Actually, the piece in this book that goes back to 1999 is my exchange with Deepesh Chakraborty, your colleague. And that was exactly the sort of question that I was asking myself then, that what I see happening in the world, how do you deal with it, how do you explain it? And I think often these things are better observed at the margin, rather than at the center. So for me, way back then, even in, just being in the Sundarban, you could see that that a certain trajectory of trying to create, as it were, industrial progress, industrial growth, and so on, actually brings you very quickly to a sort of end point where it's completely unsustainable. So, what are you going to do? How do you address this? Because in the Sundarban, where I've been going since I was a child, even back then, you could see, the bird life was so depleted. You hardly saw birds, in fact. And when I was young, you would go to the Sundarban, and on the mud banks would turn red at times, because of the crabs. I mean, the keystone species of the Sundarban is not the tiger, it's the crab. It's the crab that makes life in the mangrove forest possible. They aerate the soil, they do all sorts of, they do away with leaf litter, all of those things. But the crabs were disappearing, So you could just sense the sort of incredible crisis that's in there, but which these people who live in the Sundarban bear no responsibility for, because they lead very frugal lives. One is tempted to say poor, but I think one of the delusions of the modern world is really how we judge wealth and poverty. I mean, these sorts of, how shall I say, the way that these things are measured seems to me so misleading, and actually they're drivers in their own right of the problems that we are in.
Just to pick up on that, so if I understand that the idea is that we've been on this, what appeared like a kind of steady, linear upward trajectory of greater efficiency and productivity and consumption, and then it hit a point where it's created all of these crises and problems, and is no longer going to be able to continue, and moreover may sort of implode or explode. And one of the sources of that you talk about in one of the essays, I think this is this problem of mimesis, that people in the global South are made to feel impoverished and not just frugal. And how do you think of the possibility of addressing that kind of problem? I mean,
well, if you go anywhere in the global South, and I've done this a lot in India, Indonesia, many places, you go to places that are very obviously impacted by, our planetary crisis. So, for example, I went to a place called Ternate. Have any of you heard of Ternate? Letter from Ternate by Alfred Wallace, which began the whole. He wrote this letter to Darwin, and it was about, it kicked off the whole theory of evolution and so on. Well, anyway, so Ternate is an amazing place because until the 17th century, it was the only place in the world where cloves grew, where the clove tree grew. The clove tree was endemic, to Ternate. It's in the Spice Islands. So there's this series of islands, 5 beautiful islands, volcanic islands, just these huge volcanoes arising out of the sea. And, volcanoes are magical. I mean, they have these amazing forests that create incredible wonders. And before the modern era, really, the global trade was driven by a desire for luxury goods. A lot of them came from, in fact, the farthest part of the Indian Ocean, sandalwood, cloves, nutmeg, mace, etc. Anyway, so in Ternate now, when I was last there, which was, I think, 2016, it was terrible to see that the clove trees were actually dying on this island, which gave birth to the clove tree. Because the changes in climate, there were forest fires. Can you imagine this tropical island having these terrible forest fires and so on. Anyway, so I very much wanted, and this island has been ruled by the same dynasty of sultans for like 700 years. And the last representative of this dynasty is still sitting in the kraton, the royal palace there. So I went to him and I said, do you feel that people on Ternate should reduce their carbon footprint because they're so much threatened by climate change? And he said to me, why should we reduce our carbon footprint? They must reduce their carbon footprint first because they got rich when we were poor and weak. Now it's our turn. And since then, I've asked this question in many places in Asia and Africa, and that's almost always the response that you get. So what does this response signify? And as I said, in that essay, it's a mimetic response, They have that, so I must also have it, And so we are caught in this cycle of, as it were, mimetic competition. And that is what is, in one sense, dooming us, where everybody thinks, and this is something that has been very consciously pushed on the world since 1990 by the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus essentially said that the only way to live is like an American, with 2 cars and, a fridge and all the rest. And actually, anybody from the global south, or certainly anyone from India, could have said that if every household in India were to live like that, the world would collapse. This is actually something that Gandhi said in 1920. And he actually took the step of saying that we will not live in that way. We will not be mimetic in that way. I don't think any politician anywhere in the world today could say that. But, this whole thing about mimesis it's at one level, it's very sad and depressing that everybody thinks that they must live in this way. But at the same time, there is a possibility in it. If people in so-called affluent countries begin to change their way of life, then it follows that it'll establish a completely different pattern for people to aspire to. And I do think that's happening, I think that's happening amongst young people in the West, perhaps more in Europe than over here. But, people are actively moving away from that kind of life, over-consuming kind of life. Certainly, that seemed to me very clear in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it's been coming back, and you can see how powerfully young people feel about these things in the United States. I mean, look at the election of Zoran Mamdani, So, the whole sort of mimetic rivalry situation both closes the door, but opens the door as well.
Thank you. That sounds more hopeful than you sound in many of these essays, which is good. We can use some hope. I think that this problem, to the extent it is a problem, is related to one of the claims in the book that I found most challenging, not to say shocking, which is this, as you put it, that the ethical and political dilemmas of the climate crisis and the need for drastic action might come at the cost of abandoning the emancipatory ideals that have come to undergird our thinking. And I wonder if you could say more about, what would it mean to abandon these emancipatory ideals, which I think are related to primarily focus on increasing in opportunities and being free of oppression and so on. I mean, can we abandon the ideal of progress without abandoning ideals of equality and social justice?
Well, in fact, through the whole period of colonization, those ideals didn't apply at all. I mean, the whole pattern of the British presence in South Asia was to actively deindustrialize, the colonies, because they needed the colonies to produce, as it were, solar-based products, various agricultural products. So, in fact, there was an incredible enthusiasm for the fossil fuel economy in India, going back, to the late 18th century. In fact, the early steamboats and steam engines were largely financed by Indian industrialists. But, by, as it were, manipulating the financial structure, the British were able to kill off those early efforts in India. And that created the paradox that if, in fact, India had begun to industrialize in the 19th century, can you imagine the quantum of greenhouse gases that would now be in the atmosphere? But again, if India had industrialized in the 19th century, we would have become aware of this problem much earlier, at a time when it was actually possible to adopt, alternative energy on a much wider scale. Because after all, these energies, they existed. I'm sure many of you will know the work of Andreas Malm, and he shows us that really so much of early industrialization was built upon wind power and, on hydropower. The reason that those powers, that kind of energy wasn't adopted at scale had nothing to do with efficiency. It was basically because fossil fuels served the interests of industrialists. It gave them power over the working class. And, of course, it gave them power over their colonies and so on. So, to come back to what I was saying there, is that, you can see, certainly on the far right, who was it? Was it that guy Shapiro or something? Who said the US should bomb all the coal, the coal plants that produce electricity in China? They should be bombed. So that would solve the climate crisis.
Direct action.
So you can see on the far right, that's a sort of part of the fantasy that you can deindustrialize, as it were, the global south, and that would solve the problem. But, unfortunately for the far right, the global south, especially China, and now we see Iran also, is not as helpless as it was in the 18th and 19th centuries. So deindustrializing the global south is no longer a realistic possibility.
So is it then less a matter of abandoning emancipatory ideals than just like actually realizing them or conceiving them properly? It sounds like ultimately these two things ought to go together, but I may not be understanding properly.
I think emancipatory ideals have long since been abandoned.
Okay.
And they're not coming back in a hurry. In many ways, what we see as the polycrisis unfolding around us, because we are from, how shall I say, a university kind of community. I'm not, but you are, and most of the people who talk about the polycrisis are from academic backgrounds and so on. And they tend to think of it in a gradualist way. If I may make a comparison with geological thinking, between gradualist thinking and catastrophist thinking. So most people within this world of ours are gradualists. They think that the polycrisis actually has policy solutions which could be implemented if they were taken up at scale. But the people who are actually in power are catastrophists. And they believe that the real solution to the polycrisis is a mega death event where billions will perish. They think that these billions will perish in the global south. I think they're wrong, and of course, poor people also, in the US and other affluent countries. But this is no longer, this was the part that couldn't be said aloud at a certain point, but it is now said aloud. I mean, there are, especially in Silicon Valley, there are all these thinkers, so-called, philosophers and such like, including very highly trained philosophers like Nick Bostrom. I don't know if you know the name. He's an Oxford philosopher. I mean, who actually believed that, and you remember that guy who came up with, what was it? Then he got called out for fraud. I'm forgetting his thing. But he came out with this extreme version of Benthamite thinking, where he says it's better that billions of people die today so that multiple billions will live in the distant future. So they find their ways of thinking around these issues in various ways. But I hate to say it, but really the actual elites, especially in the West, I think are now very much fixed in this way of catastrophist thinking.
Well, maybe so. Sorry, I need to recover from that a little bit. So maybe thinking about the alternative to mass death as the solution to our problem. In the Great Derangement, and we were talking about this a bit in our seminar before class, you make a strong argument, much of which is in the form of provocative questions about the need for new forms of fiction that will help us better imagine our situation, picture it, and also new forms of political imagination that I think are less focused on individual action and more on collective action. Can you say more about how those two go together? Do they do the need for new literary imagination and new political imagination?
Well, I imagine if I were like 40 years younger, I would be very involved in political stuff and thinking about politics in an important way. But I'm not, and basically I'm a writer of fiction. So I can only confront these things. I mean, the most effective way in which I can confront these issues is to try and address them through my fiction. And that's really what I'm trying to do now. Because I think, the really sad part of what has happened under the circumstances of modernity, and which I also write about in The Great Derangement, is that fiction has come to be, at the same time, it's an important aspect, it's an important part of public culture, but it's been pushed into a position where it's become kind of entirely, how shall I say, human-centered. It's completely anthropocentric. Our fiction has, since the late 18th century onwards. Because if you think of earlier forms of fiction, let's say, the Odyssey, the Iliad, even the Bible, they're filled with so many kinds of non-human agency. The same is true of the great Indian epics. So you might even say that fiction was the one form within human life where creators, where writers, thinkers were given a license to imagine non-human agency. Non-human voices, non-human beings, non-human agency. But from the 19th century onwards, in effect, writers stopped doing that. They stopped thinking about the non-human. They stopped thinking about non-human agency. And, this may not have anything very direct to do with our polycrisis, but I feel that is the fundamental challenge that faces me as a writer and that faces the literary world in general. that of trying to imagine and give voice to non-human agency. And in fact, I see that happening very much within the world of fiction. And I think that, for me, is a very hopeful thing.
Thank you. I definitely wanted to ask about non-human agency, which I think my 21st century Western mind is really still struggling to wrap its mind around. There's a moment in The Hungry Tide, which I realize you wrote a long time ago now, but where one of the characters says, it wasn't you who brought me here, it was the storm that brought me here. Or, there are various moments of talking about these things as having caused things, which makes sense to me. I'm still struggling to understand what it means to say that the storm has agency, or the system. It sounds like also like systems, like technological systems you talk about as having agency too. So how do we think about that agency?
Well, technological agency is now talked about all the time in terms of AGI and AI and so on. But I think there are many other forms of agency. It's all around us all the time. We now know that forests, trees in a forest communicate with each other. In multiple different ways. Anat Singh's marvelous book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, shows us that forests actually create history. They act historically. We know that about whales. So in the early 19th century, when American and European whalers started killing off whale populations on a large scale, they responded historically by withdrawing deeper and deeper into the Arctic. So they were thinking historically. And these are just two very obvious examples. And I'm sure the world around us is filled with many other examples of that. And I've been writing about opium for a very long time, and I actually wrote a book about the opium poppy, and it's called Smoke and Ashes. And certainly, anyone who really engages with the history of opium, at some point you get this uncanny feeling that this is a thinking being. It's outwitting us. It's outwitting every human attempt to control it. It is a very uncanny feeling, Because look at the poppy, it's just a humble flower. It's so common, it just grows wild. And yet, it defeated the US Army in Afghanistan. It's such a strange thing. But so I think the world around us is filled with all kinds of agency. And actually, the only place where we are allowed to write about this form of agency is, if you like, in literature, in music, in song. So if we don't do it, if we as writers and creators don't do it, who is going to? It's not going to be historians or economists.
Do you see the situation as having gotten any better since when you wrote about this problem in the Great Derangement? I'm thinking about Richard Powers, the overstory, the whole sort of genre of cli-fi, and presumably you are doing this in your work as well, and maybe just some examples, if there are any good ones, of what it looks like to put non-human agency back into fiction.
Well, writers have been doing that for a long time. It's not like writers were not doing the work. I would say that the problem lies within the broader ecosystem of literature, Because, who are the publishers? Who are the people who run the big magazine reviews and magazines? They're actually incredibly conservative. And why would you expect otherwise? They're usually men who've been very highly trained at places like the University of Chicago, and their idea of literature is really, it goes back to 19th century models often. And that's what they're looking for when they're looking for manuscripts. So writers have been doing this, but I would say that a certain kind of writing had been marginalized by the broader ecosystem of literature. But that has certainly changed, And, there are so many wonderful examples of books that are very directly responding to the planetary crisis, if you like. Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, for example, is a wonderful book. And she herself is deep. I think she was a geologist originally. So she's deeply engaged with these issues. Another writer who's very engaged with these issues and whose way of looking at these issues is very much like mine, because she sees these things historically, is Annie Proulx, who wrote Brokeback Mountain, but she's also written a wonderful book called Barkskins, which has also been made into a series. And she really sees, the problem deriving from patterns of deforestation and terraforming, in North America. There are many others. Richard Powers is a very good example. But I think my current favorite is Ruth Ozeki. I don't know if any of you know her work, but Ruth is, she's a Zen priest. And she's very engaged with this idea of, non-human agency, if you like. I mean, one of her books, I think it's her most recent one, is about a book writing itself, through a human interlocutor.
Thank you. So in Wild Fictions, you had this idea. I think this is related to this idea of agency. You talk about the environmental unconscious as being represented in stories that see nature as spiritually imbued, and they wed the pragmatic to the poetic. And a lot of your examples of this are in folktales and in traditional stories. Is there a difference between the way that this comes out in folktales and traditional stories than in modern literature? Do we need new myths in addition to new literature? Or how do you see the relation between these things?
Well, by the time I finished writing The Great Derangement, I was pretty much persuaded that, that the modern novel doesn't really give us the resources to deal with the crisis that we are currently in. So I felt I had to look elsewhere. And so I started reading pre-modern literature. Unfortunately, I have Bengali. And Bengali has a very rich pre-modern literary tradition. And I started reading, they're called Mangal Kavyas, that is, how would we translate Mangal Kavya? It's like, beneficent literature is what you might. But basically, these are praise poems to various gods and goddesses. And I became particularly fascinated by one of them, which is about, it's called Padma Puran. It's about the goddess of snakes, Manasa Devi, Monisha Devi, we would say in Bangla. And I became very fascinated by that. It tells a very ancient story, a story that is actually so ancient in Eastern India that it predates Hinduism even. So the story is about a conflict between the goddess of snakes and a very avaricious merchant, So the goddess of snakes reveals herself to this merchant and says, "You must become my disciple." And the merchant says, "No, I won't." So she sends all these terrible calamities upon him, tidal waves, storms, plagues of snakes and so on. And ultimately he runs away and he travels to various places. Then he comes back and finally she manages to establish her control over this guy. But what really struck me here is that the goddess of snakes wasn't just the goddess of snakes. She was actually speaking for an entire gamut of non-human beings, including weather phenomena and so on. And it was literally that she was a translator for them. She was trying to give them voice. And see how beautifully it's conceived of, that the needs of humans have to be balanced against the needs of other beings. So she is actually trying to hold in, trying to restrain the profit motive, for this merchant. So already back then, this was completely conceptualized. The fundamental dynamic of our polycrisis, that, if you let human beings just run riot and, in their search for profit, then the world will be eaten up, and you have to find some sort of balancing mechanism. So, reading these stories, it was incredibly generative for me, I have to say. I just began to see things in a completely different way. And, I embraced it in my fiction. So that's the weird thing. I mean, it just became so productive for me to engage with these texts. And I feel so grateful in retrospect to my parents who really insisted on my learning Bangla, which I very much resisted because, at the time, but which I feel very grateful for now.
Yeah, thank you. When I first started getting into these essays, as a appreciator and sometimes writer of fiction myself, I was very excited to get into your thoughts on fiction in here, and was a little bit dismayed when I discovered that the actual, the source of the quote, wild fictions is a sort of negative idea, the fiction of a pristine nature. And you write about the deleterious effects that fiction has had. But it sounds sort of like, in some sense, the only way to fight the bad fictions is with good fictions. Maybe not the only way, but a key part of it, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think one of the terrible things, that's come out of a sort of modernist imaginary is the idea of a pristine nature, and it comes very much from an American context, establishing all the great, national parks and so on. The whole idea being that you create pristine nature by moving people out. So that's what it became. You moved indigenous Native Americans out of these great parks like Yosemite and so on, even though they had actually maintained, those landscapes. And this has repeated itself on a massive scale in India, and is doing so today. And it's actually such a violent and terrible process. I mean, can you imagine removing the Zulu from the Ngorongoro crater, and with helicopter gunships paid for by these South African billionaires, I mean, there's a very important, so much has been written about it, but the World Wildlife Fund was literally doing this. It was removed, I mean, it's just, what is it? It's ethnic cleansing. You move the indigenous people out, and you move in tourism industries, that cater to middle-class people in cities and, Western tourists. And it has the most terrible effect in the long run, because none of these landscapes are ever pristine. I mean, we know now that the Amazon actually sustained maybe as many as 9 million people. And that, in some sense, it's more like a garden than a forest. And it's exactly that's now upsetting. I mean, that's going to flip the Amazon into from being a carbon sink into being a net carbon emitter. And this process is continuing, at an increasing pace in India, where, the tourism industry, other hospitality industries and so on, are just making these huge land grabs under the guise of, what should we call it, wildlife preservation or whatever.
Thank you. One more question for now on my behalf, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So we're here in the Graham School, and we do the liberal arts and the humanities. And what should we in the humanities be doing be doing about this? What should we in the Graham School be doing about this? What did the humanities, sort of beyond maybe fiction literature, but the study of fiction, literature, and humanistic problems, what can they offer these issues?
I think the humanities are absolutely crucial to understanding what is happening around the world today. And it absolutely amazes me that people in humanities departments haven't been more strident about in making their claims on these issues, Because you look at any single disaster or any major weather event, if you like. I mean, Hurricane Katrina, for example. Yes, there was a supercharged storm that acted in weird ways, But at the same time, the real destruction, the real disaster, didn't even happen during the hurricane. It happened afterwards, where there was this very highly militarized response, and that militarized response was rooted in very old patterns of, institutional racism and so on, and in the way that urban planning occurred within New Orleans. So, yes, climate scientists can tell us, they can do attribution studies and tell us, the degree to which this event was climate intensified, so to speak. But the actual effects on the ground, you can't understand them without history, without sociology, without demography, without all those disciplines. And you look at it everywhere in the world, this pattern replicates itself. So, for example, in Chennai, formerly Madras, in India, we've had these endless number of these great flood events, terrible floods. But these floods have come about because of certain patterns of urban settlement. People have been building on riverbeds, etc. Now, who is going to lay these things bare if it's not for humanists? It's only the humanities that can point these absolutely obvious facts out. And I just don't understand why they are so, what can I say, so deferential towards the sciences, instead of asserting their claim to have a voice on these issues.
Thank you very much. Can we start taking some questions from the audience? Someone was supposed to have a microphone. Yes, please. Here.
Thank you all so much for hosting the Graham School and for being here today. So, you were talking about catastrophic versus gradualist thinking. Where do you think this comes from? And how much do you think it comes from, the different narratives that we expose kids to, whether it's through news media, the real world and the imagined worlds that we give kids? In some ways it seems like you were a little pessimistic about policy prescriptions. But if we think, for example, that it does come through the different ways that we shape collective memory, through popular culture or stories or narratives, then we might be able to even think about being very intentional about the content we give kids by shaping, what goes into the school textbooks that every kid has to see, or, what are those narratives? Is it more, catastrophist versus gradualist? And, does it seem to matter, in terms of who ends up being in power versus not?
The thing about the whole catastrophist imaginary as it's emerged today, the whole idea of transhumanism, for example, which is so important for these Silicon Valley billionaires and so on, is that it comes out of ultimately, a very deep tradition of thinking about biology in essentially racial ways, And I think that's really what is at work here. In a strange way, the most influential aspect of the sciences really has been, if you like, a sort of very race-based kind of idea of looking at the world, eugenicist. So eugenicism has been driven out of, shall we say, out of polite company, but it's lurking in the background of all this kind of thinking.
Thank you very much. Appreciate this talk. I want to just follow up on your last comment about why aren't the humanities standing up a little bit. How would you articulate that conversation to a group of undergraduates who are trying to decide what to major and study? How would you articulate to them the benefits of the humanities, short-term and long-term for them?
Well, I'm not, in the business of teaching, so I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that. But this I can tell you that, going around the world, I'm constantly invited to these various universities that have these environmental humanities concentrations. And these have really taken off in the last 20 years or so. Singapore alone, all its 3 major universities have environmental humanities concentrations, and they're very good, very well run. In Scandinavia, there are many of them. And of course, here in the United States, there are many of them. And what I'm always told, actually, is that whereas enrollment in other departments of the humanities has been going down, in the environmental humanities, it's been soaring. And also that the kids who come out of these environmental humanities programs actually have a very clear path to jobs because of corporate social responsibility programs and so on that they can sign on to. So I think that's certainly one aspect that could be emphasized. But I think more than that, what's really important is to give your students of history and your students of, let's say, anthropology, sociology, demography, and so on, the self-confidence to feel that these issues are not best dealt with only in the physical sciences, that they have an important role, they have something important to say there, and to give them the self-confidence to do that. And here again, I will say that, it's not the fault of the scientists. The scientists really want to hear these things, The AGU, the American Geophysical Union, which is the largest group of climate scientists, 2 years ago, they have this annual meeting, which is like 25,000 climate scientists getting together, and they invited me to do the plenary talk. And I said exactly what I'm saying to you right now. And they were not only open to it, the president of the AGU said to me that it was, it really struck a chord, So I just think it's a question of self-confidence, if you like, for the humanities.
Thank you, Amitav.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure as an Indian to have you here and
Thank you.
And speak to us, and it's fantastic. When you talk about polycrisis, a couple of words come to mind: degrowth and steady state economics. And all of these lead to a point of view that we are greedy people, and so we'll keep consuming. We are people that are wanting things all the time. We don't think about waste as taking from the earth, and we extract from the earth, but we don't generate enough. We pay people for extraction, but we don't pay people for generating from the earth. And I wonder this conflict between capitalist thinking, which goes with extraction, and generative thinking that goes towards the kind of mindset that you're bringing to this conversation. Where does this lead to eventually? Are there clear answers? And it bothers me every day. And I went to the Sundarbans. I spent 4 days on a boat, lying on the boat hull and experiencing that moment, going into villages where the crabs were there in a pot, and that was their main food. I went to one of the homes and how they lived. It gives me goosebumps to think about how they're so happy living in that environment. So, anyway, thank you. Any thoughts on these comments?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I must say it's really true that the villagers in the Sundarban lead very simple, frugal lives, and yet I must say they look great. They're so healthy looking, much more so than people in the cities of Bengal. And, they're just full of lightness and laughter. It's very hard to explain that dynamic, But it's really true. I mean, anyone who's been there and interacted will know that. Of course, there's a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty as well, but those are all parts of living as a human being. But the broader question, yes, I do certainly think about degrowth. And I think degrowth is a very good idea. But as far as I can see, most economists don't agree with that. But I was in Barcelona last week, and they're really following the whole degrowth model and implementing it, on a piece-by-piece basis. I think what we are seeing emergent in the world right now is a pattern where the nation state as it used to be is kind of receding into the background and is being replaced by a model that's based upon older city-states, So you have like New York, Barcelona, and so on, and New York's had incredible success with its bike programs, So maybe that's the way that these things will start. I mean, in Barcelona, certainly they've been implementing degrowth at a very sort of local, low level, but it's catching on. And again, you were talking about the capitalist ideas of extraction and so on. I think what's very important is to always point out, especially to economists who work with really such absurd generalities of the world, that Homo economicus hasn't always existed. And economists themselves have shown us this. Elinor Ostrom's work, most of all, has shown us that, left to themselves, people will find ways of, reaching a balance between themselves and their environment. I guess.
Last week, the world lost the great titan of photography, Raghu Rai. And when I think about his photographs, I think about how they evoke emotion and poetry and maybe nostalgia and so forth. And when you think about the power of your own fiction, I wonder how you hope that it might land on your readers. Is it operating on a similar level, or do you have other hopes and aspirations in mind?
How nice that you mentioned Raghu Rai. He actually photographed me in 1986, way back. He was a great photographer, but he was a great photographer within a great generation of photographers. Raghubir Singh, who was also a very dear friend of mine, was another really great photographer, if you ask me. But your wider question about how do I hope my writing will land, I don't think about that. I think, we are told that, writers imagine their audience and write for an audience and so on. I have to say that's never been true for me. And I literally cannot imagine what my audience is. And I don't think that you can write in that way, catering to a certain audience. I think genre writers do that. I think, writers create their own audience. They make an audience cohere around the sort of work that they do. And that's what creates an audience. I think those audience reception theories are all absolutely wrong.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Thanks for coming. You talked about the Clove Island example, and there seemed like an example of a broader collective action problem there. You know, how do you get people to think collectively and not so much about their individual interests standing alone? And in your book, you talk some about religion, maybe religion in the past, as having helped to unify people around collective action rather than just looking at their own individual interest. And I'm wondering if you have aspirations that literature can do that, or if you're looking to something else. I mean, can literature be, in your mind, so inspiring that it sort of rallies the populace to put pressure on policymakers to take effective action against global warming, or maybe directly inspires the policymakers themselves? Or is there something else we can look to solve that collective action problem, which is sort of an age-old problem?
That's a very good question. You know, I'm not a policy guy, so I can't really tell you how you could address the collective action problem. But I certainly do think that the most important thing written about climate change and about the wider polycrisis was Pope Francis's Laudato Si. You know, and Pope Francis reached more people than I would hazard than any climate scientist ever has. And I think he really brought this issue home to people, and in his later work, in his later encyclicals as well. And I'm glad to see that Pope Leo is heading in that direction as well. But it has to also be acknowledged that they are standouts, you know, they are outliers. In general, I would say that what's happened to the to religion in the modern world, I mean in the contemporary world, almost irrespective of which religion it is that they've all become a version of a Protestant kind of, what do they call it? That you know, a sort of cult of prophet. And so, you know, you see that, for example, with Buddhism in Thailand, you see it with Islam in Turkey and elsewhere. And you certainly see it also in contemporary India. It's all about, you know, how you fit a religion into getting rich, into a sort of get-rich-quick kind of theology. So, yeah, I think Pope Francis and Pope Leo are really outliers in that they've gone in exactly the other direction. But I do think that there are certain other, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, there is a sort of ontological issue involved here, you know, which is what is the earth and what is our relationship, you know, with the earth? Is it purely one of extraction? Is the earth and all these other beings around us, are they completely different from us? Do they have any rights? Do they have any kind of beingness or personhood? And in that domain, I think, for me, the most inspiring set of ideas comes from the rights of nature movement, you know, which has now become very widespread. It's a judicial form of activism. But what they've done is that they've started according or campaigning to accord personhood to various entities like forests and mountains and rivers and so on. And they've had actually considerable success. I mean, in Ecuador, the rights of nature has been written into the constitution of the country. In New Zealand, you know, the Supreme Court of New Zealand decided that the Wanganui River was not only a person, but it was actually an ancestor of the Wanganui people, you know. And if you just think about that these, who were these judges in the Supreme Court of New Zealand who decided on this? They were your usual, you know, conservative-looking, mainly white men. In their ordinary lives, the idea that a river could be their ancestor would probably have seemed absurd to them. And yet they were willing to write it into law. The same thing has happened in Iceland. You know, in Iceland regularly, when they build roads, they divert the roads to go around the rocks in which the little people live. You know, So that's the thing. I mean, as soon as you entertain these possibilities, there is an ontological shift in the way that you see the earth. So I can't do much in terms of policy, but I do hope that my books can help towards, pushing this ontological shift. Yes. Yes.
I love this conversation about big thinking, but I have a very practical writing craft question for you. I have a very practical writing craft question for you. What I've tried to do is bring entities into a scene, and most of my friends who look at it say, oh, you just jumped us out of your story. How is it possible to blend it in when a tree is starting to talk, or a grass or something? If you've encountered that and have some good advice, I'd appreciate it.
That's a very good question. Yeah, I haven't yet had talking trees, but you have to find ways around it, and it's possible. Instead of making the tree talk, make it do other kinds of meaningful things. And I think that's really. It is really a challenge. But, I think to be writing comes out of a space where these uncanny things do happen. And certainly I can tell you that as a writer myself, I've had incredibly strange and uncanny things happening to me through my writing, And I think that's really what you have to try to do, is to try and make yourself open to these, counterintuitive thoughts, if you like, a sort of counterintuitive way of understanding the world, and not just expect a mechanical responses.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Hi, Amitav. So great to hear you today. I wanted to ask, the BJP just prevailed in West Bengal, and I'm really interested in how, India, this place of so many paradoxes, and this place where, trees are worshipped and animals are cared for, coexists with, rapid industrialization, heartbreaking contamination of rivers that have already been ascribed personhood and rights and things like that. And I just wonder, how you see India grappling with that and what you think the consequences could be for the rest of us.
Well, what's happened in West Bengal is, how shall I say, I feel completely shaken by it. Not because I was so attached to the last government, not at all, but because the way that it was removed, by literally taking millions of voters off the voting lists, And the sad thing is that this is a pattern that's also going to be copied in other parts of the world. We're going to see this pattern replicating itself elsewhere. So it's a very disturbing thing. As to your other question, yes, I mean, many of us in India, we grow up, believing that the trees can talk, that, rivers are sacred, that mountains have personhood, and so on. And this has even been recognized by the judicial system, for example, in Niyamgiri and so on. But the terrible thing is that these cultural concepts have not in any way held the capitalist class in India from, adopting full-scale these ultimately colonial, extractive models of economy. So right now, the forests in India are being opened up on an unprecedented scale. to mining and to crony capitalists. Bauxite mining for aluminium is just about the most destructive form, of mining, because they literally demolish, entire forests and mountainsides, to produce a little bit of aluminum. And the weirdest part is that those companies that are doing these things, many of them are owned by vegetarians. Many of them are owned by Jain vegetarians, who won't allow, an insect to fly into their mouth. And yet, on the wider scale, they're committing this ecocide, on a scale that's almost inconceivable.
Well, I have a few that I'll pick up. We have a few more minutes. I noticed that when you listed the disciplines of the humanities, that philosophy didn't happen to come up in your list, that the disciplines that you named were more those that look at the what is the history and help us very necessarily, importantly, understand what's happening, not just in terms of science. Do you see ways in which the humanities, for instance, philosophy, can help us conceive kind of what ought to be, how we ought to comport ourselves? And I know that sometimes there's a sort of fiction versus philosophy. People fall on one side or the other of that camp. But anyway.
Yeah, I'm certainly on the fiction side of
right,
that.
yes, I would.
I mean, the reason I write fiction is because, I can't think in abstractions. I have a very empirical way of looking at things. So, yeah, but at the same time, it is interesting. There are interesting things happening within philosophy that one reads about. An increasing interest in, in Whitehead, in non-human agency again. And you see that very much coming to the fore in philosophy as well.
Yeah, well, I really like the idea of the need for an ontological shift, and it seems like one could bring all the disciplines to bear on that in one way or another. What's next for you? Oh, sorry, yes. Good.
A follow-up, maybe. Any thoughts on Thomas Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, and the power of Mother Nature in the way that, I know you've talked about human beings destroying everything, but on the other side, as Mother Nature will find a way to restore itself irrespective of what we do because we're so tiny in comparison.
Well, in 1964, a philosopher, Martin Heidegger, said, "Only a God can save us now." And maybe Mother Nature is that God. Who knows?
Or maybe she'll at least save herself. Sorry. Right, I don't mean to. Good, Jim.
Thinking about what you said, that a lot of policies and treatment of people and countries is based on racism. And I don't think that's something as a way of thinking that's formed early in life is something that's going to be corrected later in life. So what is your answer to that? It seems to me that these issues have to be dealt with much earlier than university or later in life.
Yeah, I agree. But, as we can see, policy measures intended to combat those forms of racism or discrimination are actually now coming under massive attack. DEI is being challenged across the country, being disposed of. So who knows what is the best way of dealing with it?
Thank you so much for the talk and for hosting. I guess in response to the conversation around India and how so much of this needs to be collective action, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on like the role and the impact of movement and human migration and like some kind of cultural syncretism that is happening, and like how do you preserve, like as an Indian coming from somewhere with so much respect for the earth and so much culture that's tied to that, like how do you preserve that as like we're here now in the US kind of thing?
You know, I always thought that it went very deep in our culture, you know, to tread lightly on the earth. I mean, you think of all those Indian Brahmins who wake up every morning and say the Gayatri Mantra and so on, and which is all really about treading lightly on the earth. But I think all those ideas have really been dashed over the last 30 years of this, of this capitalist acceleration. I mean, when I first traveled in the West, I always used to think how strange it is that there's only one person sitting in a car. Because in India, there was always, at least when I was young, I mean, it was always like 5 or 6 people in a car. Nobody drove in a car alone. But now, you look at it, I mean, everyone in India is in the same sort of thing. I mean, everyone's sitting alone in a car. Or you think of, I was brought up, my parents always, never be in debt. Debt is a terrible thing. And now, every time you open your computer in India in the morning, there's some bank trying to push credit on you, And I gather the lifestyles of young Indians is really largely fueled by credit. So all those ideas of restraint, of treading lightly on the earth and so on, have really just vanished. I mean, this extractivist capitalist model has monstrous power,
So I appreciated your question about, how your friend said you were writing out that, humans from nature. Actually, when you look at storybooks in the US, the most prevalent character are white men, the second most prevalent are white women, then it's all non-humans, and then it's all people of color. And there's almost this idea that if we're trying to speak to the median reader, people are more likely to want to buy something which has non-human characters than a person of color because I can relate to them. So how do you think about that tension? Because you do want to recognize that maybe the river does have a soul. Maybe there is, a quote-unquote humanity, if we want to, anthropomorphize trees or whatever it may be. How do you think about that tension, if we do want to make sure we're also highlighting the voices of underrepresented groups, human groups, in addition to, the other forms of nature that are out there. And then separately, just when you were talking about the pristine spaces, another thought that came to my mind is I remember going to a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the people who had lived in this space, they actually really wanted to put solar panels up. But because of this romanticization of what the pristine is, they weren't allowed to, because they had to keep it the way it looked 1,000 years ago and keep that up for the tourists, for the sake of the heritage site itself. And so it's almost like we're trying to preserve pristine spaces, but how do we then think about the tension of when people want to develop further or develop in the way that they want to?
Well, the first part of your question, I think the main thing is not to be held back by anxiety, not to be held back by the thought that your friends will make fun of you if you say the river is a person or something, or that the tree can talk or whatever. And I think we've really got to reclaim that space, that historically belonged to writers, where you could say, the tree speaks, or the oracle speaks, and the oracle has always spoken, whether it be at Delphi or wherever. So we have to be able to reclaim those spaces, and also to reclaim, if you like, a more mythic voice. And I know it's often very difficult to do that, especially in prose, but it's much easier to do in poetry. So if you feel stuck, writing in that vein, just try writing it in meter and rhyme. You'll see.
I pulled it out the other entities write in poetry. whereas the people go through prose.
Yeah.
And they thought it was too much of a jump. But maybe I should just live with it.
Yes, yes.
We have time for one more question.
Do you want to do it? All right. Hi, it was wonderful hearing you and honestly learning so much. So interestingly, I grew up in Calcutta. I was born and brought up there. I remember going to Jaggu Bazaar, with my grandfather. And even at that stage, he would have his own plastic bags that he would bring, right, to do his shopping. I mean, that's how it was ingrained, right, in our heads that, sustainability is just the way of life. You didn't use paper towels, you used, the same cloth napkins, etc. So with that being said, I'm just so curious, what is it that imbibed, this curiosity, this passion for reading, the passion to continue to, explore climatic impacts in your life? Like, what set you up earlier in your life to become what you are today? I'm just curious. Like, I have young children, and I'd love to know, that.
Well, certainly, like so many Indians of my age and so on, and so many Bengalis of my age, I grew up in a family that kind of fetishized literature, So it was almost inevitable in a way that I would end up writing, because, there was really a kind of fetish of literature, I would say, in Bengal for, maybe 150 years or so. And that certainly played a large part in it.
Right. Thank you so much. I would have asked what's next, but I know that you have a book coming out in June, Ghost Eye. Look for it on the shelves. Anything else that you're willing to tell us?
No, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for inviting
Thank
me.
you so much, Amitav. And thank you all for your questions.